Garrett, I have to ask, why the Gap? Why were they singled out in particular? Was it because most of their clothing was made at Rana Plaza?
It's a good question. The Gap hasn't been confirmed as a brand that was being produced at Rana Plaza. But the reason we're going after the Gap is in 2010, 29 workers burned alive in a Gap supplier factory in Bangladesh. And following that factory fire, we asked the Gap, along with Bangladeshi and international unions across the world, to sign on to a binding fire and building safety agreement. After 2 years of negotiations, the Gap pulled out and went at it alone with their own voluntary, self-regulatory, business-as-usual program that will do absolutely nothing to prevent these tragedies from occurring in the future. In addition, the Gap brands itself as a supposedly socially responsible company, but they have to live up to that image. If they're going to say that they actually care about workers' rights, they care about social responsibility, they should enshrine those commitments in a binding agreement that will obligate them to make their factories safe.
So in effect, Gap is a repeat offender that broke away from previous attempts to create accountability for these situations and ended up creating a voluntary structure to do this, which you say was ineffective. And I think some third-party sources have confirmed that many of the attempts by multinational corporations to set up sort of voluntary safety investigations, or through things like the Fair Labor Association, if I'm not mistaken, have been shown to be completely ineffective, and more attempts at protecting the public relations of these companies and not. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, if the Gap really cared about making their factories safe and about allowing workers to form unions to monitor their own workplaces, why would they not make that commitment a binding commitment, a legally binding commitment? And the answer is that they're not really interested in that commitment. They would rather have a voluntary program that they can wave around to consumers in the media that seemingly looks good, but in reality won't actually change the working conditions that these Bangladeshi workers are working under. Had they signed on to the fire safety agreement following the factory fire in 2010, we could have seen these subsequent tragedies avoided. But even though the Gap just wasn't in Rana Plaza, they certainly have blood on their hands for the deaths of workers at Rana Plaza because of their refusal to sign on to this agreement when they had the chance.
Garrett, I have to ask, of course, Take Action News, we're always trying to provide people with opportunities to take action to influence outcomes. And one of those, perhaps, is the kinds of purchases that we make. And I encourage everyone to go to Deathtraps.com to help hold Gap accountable and to create a new safety regime for all U.S. and multinational companies that do retail work that for clothing that is made in these developing countries. But I have to ask, are there any clothing companies out there that do have acceptable safety standards who, in the meantime, while we're working to hold Gap and other companies accountable, folks can give preference to their products?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, in my opinion, that's not going to do anything to change the situation in Bangladesh. The only thing that will change the situation in Bangladesh is major buyers from the country signing on to a binding agreement that will obligate them to renovate their factories. And the only way we're going to get retailers like the Gap to do that is if consumers take action, they deliver letters, they picket stores, they sign petitions, they do everything they can to actually hold the corporation accountable. And that is really the way that we're going to get conditions in Bangladesh to change. Unfortunately, simply buying a garment that isn't made in sweatshop is supposedly that it's fairly made, it won't actually change the situation in Bangladesh. What we need is for folks to get out there and hit the streets to hold the company accountable.
Garrett Strain from United Students Against Sweatshops. You can take action, folks, by going to GapDeathTraps.com. It's time. No more. No, we can't ignore this anymore. Garrett, thanks so much for joining us on Take Action News.
All right, thanks so much.
Folks, we may look back on this time as the moment when we woke up to the horrible moral human tragedy that are working conditions in the developing world that we depend on for our own products. It was looking for a moment like this would be, sadly, just another routine tragedy of garment workers in the developing world. But now it's become the largest garment factory disaster ever. If you're not going to take action now, when will you? Go to gapdeathtraps.com to do that. Take Action News continues. We're going to be talking about other news this week, and that was the rescue of 3 women in Cleveland who had been kidnapped and held for 10 years. And the hero, Charles Ramsey, who's getting a lot of attention in the media. When Take Action News continues after this.